As we begin looking at different types of materials, I want to point out something here in our actual scene that we'll be working in, and that's that the overall scene has a fair amount of complexity with some replicators being used to attach these varying different types of panels to the walls that are illuminating the scene, and also just kind of giving a little bit of kind of varied interest and just something else going on in the scene besides a plain background. But if you want to be able to look just directly at the textures that we're creating and get the fastest possible redraw time with the preview render, it's going to be better to simplify what's going on here. So here you can see I've got a version of this sitting here. We're focused on one of the balls. We're looking at the ball cam 1, so looking at ball number 1. The first sphere here, and this has taken a couple of minutes in order to get this refined to this point. All right, so I'm going to hop over real quickly here to the model tab just to show something that's going on here. So as we work with replicators, we always need some kind of base for the geometry, and in this case I'm just using a boxed out area, which let's go ahead and show here, which is basically the same shape, and it's a series of 2 by 2 grids. So all of these individual panels are 2 meters by 2 meters, and then each one of these polygons for the replicator has a varying piece attached to it. All right, but in order to get a faster redraw time and get some faster renders and preview the materials more efficiently, I've taken this base mesh here and I've attached to the majority of the surface just the same material that is on the base of the panels themselves. So this is just a simple kind of light gray with a little bit of blurred reflection material. Okay, and then I've also taken and applied to the same panels that have the lighting panels on it, so the panels that have some illumination on them. I've attached to the same material that has the light, so it's casting some light. So we're going to end up with a real similar lighting scenario if you choose to go with having room geo visible and the replicator hidden. We'll have the same kind of overall lighting and feel as if we were to switch these two out. So you can see just here on this side, you know, we've got like a bunch of panels that are illuminated that have a light on them, and if I switch those out with just the basic geometry, you can see that the same panels have illumination. It's much simpler, and it's not going to have any of the little extra facets or anything on it, but you know, it will give us the same kind of overall lighting scenario with a much faster redraw time. So I'm going to hop over here to the render tab, and you can see with the room geo there and the replicator hidden, if I turn this on now and I allow this to redraw, now if you recall, this took about 2.5 minutes to get fairly refined, and this is already looking pretty good, mostly because without the extra complexity, the shaders will have the appearance of resolution much more quickly, and you can see here that we're going to be, you know, in the ballpark of about 30 seconds to get a full resolution render like this. So for the sake of this video, in this lesson, I'm going to be leaving the simpler version on, but just know that if you want to get something that's a little more interesting while you're working on your materials, you can go ahead and just hide the room geo and turn the replicator on, and you'll be able to see that. But for now, we're just going to work with the basic room here. So looking at materials, we can break them down into two kind of broad categories that will allow us to attack these in a little bit of an organized fashion. And those are going to have to do with the way that they receive and transmit light. So if I click on just this sphere here that's in the middle of my scene, you'll see that I have two separate tabs up here in my properties panel here. So I have material ref and material trans. Now there are some other things here that will give you a little bit more depth, but the majority of your work will be done in these two panels. So material ref is going to be everything that is an opaque solid material. So no translucency, no transparency, and no emission of light. So you can see like these polygons up here that are actually casting light into the scene. That isn't something that we'll consider here in the material ref panel. So solid, opaque, non-transparent, non-translucent materials. And we can look at these on a number of different levels, and what we're going to do is build a few separate materials and just see how the settings and the overall idea behind the material creation plays out here on this model. So what's on here right now is just the basic default material. So if you select a polygon or you select an object and you press M and assign a new material, you're going to get something that looks like this. You can see that my diffuse color and my specular color are both white. This is a physically based shader, as that's the default. My diffuse amount is set to 80%, and my specular and Fresnel are set to 4% and 100% respectively. And the roughness is set to 40%, which is why we have kind of these soft reflections on here. So this kind of a material is going to be kind of your basic non-reflective material. Non-reflective because we don't see any actual reflections in here. We get the idea of the highlight from this light over here, but we can't see any detail of the light. We can't see its shape or its form or anything like that. In order to be able to see more of that, we would want to turn down the roughness in order to see that. So here, let's actually start by doing that. I'm going to actually take and turn my shading model to fast. And let's just change this sphere roughness down to, let's go to 10%. And when I do that, you can see all of a sudden, instead of just some varying amounts of brightness here, I can see all of the individual lights or the light polygons that are here in this scene. With your basic setup here with an 80% or something like that diffuse and a very low specular amount and a high Fresnel, like 100%, you can basically think of this as kind of a plastic or a painted surface. So this is going to be the kind of things that are going to have varying levels of reflectivity, but predominantly the surface is just a solid color. All right, so I could take and change the color here. Let's make this some kind of a blue. All right, we can see that the majority of what's going on here is really just a color with a little bit of reflectivity added over the top. And oftentimes you will take this, if you think of different types of paint is a good way to look at this, where you could think this would be something like a glossy paint, right? So you paint it, you put it on a surface, and you're actually going to see some reflection in it. If you look at the glancing angles, you'll see more of the reflection, and you can actually see this Fresnel effect very clearly here on the side of this object, where we can see that this kind of lower left or the left side edge of this light reflection is not very white, but as it goes towards that edge, and this is that glancing angle where the Fresnel effect takes over, it becomes more and more white. Okay, so that's going to be a good demonstration of the Fresnel effect. Here at the center, something that should be white or would be white if this was 100% reflective, so something like this light right here, is really fairly blue. We're not seeing much of that white pop through. But as you get towards that edge, the Fresnel effect at 100% takes over and you start to see that. Now, this kind of reflection is something that you'll really see realistically all over the place. And if you take something like a door that has a really kind of matte looking paint on it, so nothing very shiny, but if you take a white door, for example, because it's going to be more obvious, and you take a red object and hold it up to the door, when you look straight at the door, you're not going to see any reflection. But if you kind of look edge long down along the door, you'll actually see that red color reflected in the door. The difference between the matte paint and the glossy paint is going to be how blurred those reflections are. With a roughness value very low, say 10, 15% or lower, you're going to get this look of a glossy paint. But if we increase this, we'll get increasingly more matte looking paint. So if I take this up to 40%, which was our default, we'll see that, we still can see something going on and we get the idea that those lights are there, but there's no definition to them. If we continue to increase this, let's go up to 60%, you can see that more of those details start to fade away, and now really what we get is the effect of light contribution. So this light here is going to cause us that highlight, but we really don't know if that's a light or if it's just a bright object or what, because there isn't enough detail in here for us to really know. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn my shading model back to full now as well, so we can see some added details. Now, as I continue to increase this, so let's go up to say 80%. If I go up to 80%, we'll see more and more of the fade out of the actual reflections until you get to a point where really it's just looking like almost a chalky surface. So if I go all the way up to 100%, for example, we'll see that this surface becomes rather chalky. Now at this point, you kind of reach a tipping point where you need to decide how much render time you're willing to devote to an individual material, because with our roughness value set this high, all the way up to 100%, we're really not seeing much in the way of reflection. So it's the kind of option where you may want to just turn off your specular and your reflection altogether. Usually if I get above a roughness value of say 50 or 60%, I will tend to turn the actual specular amount off, so all the way down to 0, just because here at the center of the object, the contribution is so minimal that we won't notice much of a difference, but it's adding extra render time to our object. So if I take this, and let's let this kind of finish up here, you can see it's looking like it's going to take, around 50 seconds to a minute. All right, now if I turn the specular amount down to 0, but I leave my Fresnel, we should notice a significantly faster resolution. So you can see right now we're at only not even 10 seconds, and it's really pulling up and going to finish this up much more quickly. So if we let this go, we're looking at maybe about a 20-second render for something that looks very similar. You can see here, because the Fresnel amount is still set to 100%, we still see some of this highlight around the edges. We don't see any here in the center, but those reflections were so blurred out that we may not even notice, and our render time is going to be in the ballpark of half the amount of render time. Obviously, that will vary from scene to scene, and because I only changed the sphere at the center of the scene, that's also going to impact this, because we're still having the same amount of render time for everything else in the scene. So just something to keep in mind there. All right, so this is going to be a good example of a really basic material. I could go one step further here and actually kill the Fresnel as well. So I could take this down to 0, and you can see we lost our little highlight here at the edge, but the sphere got clarified and lost its grain almost instantaneously. So it took almost 0 render time to get this surface, as opposed to the one that has some Fresnel, and even more compared to the one that has some Fresnel and some specular amount. So these are going to be things that you want to balance as you work on materials like this. So moving on, let's look at some of the other options that we have, and I'm going to leave this one set here as kind of our solid, opaque, non-reflective example. And let's hop over to camera 2. So to hop between these, what I'm going to do is I have both of these set to my render cam. So if I take my render camera here, which is on my render options under frame, and I change now to ball 2, it's actually going to switch my camera over, so now I'm looking at this second sphere. And so with this sphere, I want to look at a more of a semi-gloss kind of look. So I'm going to take this, and actually a semi-gloss is kind of like the default, but I want to show you some extra options that you have when working on this. So I'm going to press Q and escape to clear out my tool pipe so I don't have anything else selected, and that will simplify my properties panel. Just a side note tip there. And now I'm going to click on this sphere again, and we can see again we're greeted by the default settings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my diffuse color here again. So let's go with something, we did bluish before, so let's go kind of something orangey. All right, so this is our basic kind of material. It has some soft reflections, but that's really all that's going on here. So when we start looking at reflective objects, we have a few options for things that we can do. And I'm going to make this kind of a semi-reflective object. So I'm going to turn my roughness down to, say, 20%. So we start to see some reflections, but everything is still fairly soft and brushed. Now, once you start seeing reflections a bit more heavily in your objects, you may want to consider changing the specular color. Now, this will play out much more definitely when we're looking at something like a chrome, a fully reflective material. But in this case, I'm also going to change this a little bit, and what this will do is it will help tie in the reflections with the material itself, and it will change the overall feel of the object. So if I take this, and let's just go for a kind of a lighter orangish, reddish kind of color, you can see that now my reflections have been tinted a bit. As we get towards that glancing angle with that Fresnel, that tinting becomes less evident, so we'll actually get back down to seeing the white color in the reflections. But here at the center of the object, you can see it makes it look a bit more deep and rich in the paint. Okay, so one last thing that we'll look at here before we move on to a more truly reflective object is going to be looking at clear coat. So what clear coat is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's like adding another layer of clear coat on top of our paint. So if I take my clear coat amount and set it to, say 50%, which is fairly high, we'll see that here in the center, we get a little bit of reflection. Okay, you can see there's a little bit of reflection here, and these are by default going to be clear, crisp reflections with no blur or roughness to them. And you can see that the reflection amount increases, again, obeying that Fresnel effect, so that we get more and more reflection getting towards the edges. All right, now this will become more pronounced if I increase the roughness of the underlying paint, which is kind of our basic surface. So I'm going to take my roughness and turn it back up to 40%. And at 40%, if you recall, we can't really see any of the details of the surrounding environment. So we'll see the overall impact of highlights, but we can't really define any of the individual lights in the scene. With our clear coat turned on, in this case at 50%, we can still see a clear amount of reflection, and it's going to tie in and correlate with the same areas where we'll get highlights in that blurred reflective underpaint. Okay, so adding some clear coat on top will give you a nice extra option for creating the look of a more deep shader. Now you can also control some roughness for the clear coat. So a clear coat doesn't have to be 100% shiny. You could take and add, say, let's go 5% roughness. And now I'm just going to mouse over a little area here. You can see that's a fairly subtle change. Let's go up to 15%. And now you can see we're starting to get a little bit more of a fade out of that crispness. We still get the overall idea, and we can still make out those lights, but it's becoming less and less pronounced. And then one other option that you have here, and we'll see this come into play a bit more when we're looking at textures, but there's a clear coat bump amount. So what you can think about with clear coat bump is it would be like taking a surface, say we have a wood surface, and we're going to paint over the wood with some kind of a clear coat finish, some kind of sealant. Now the clear coat bump, when it's set to 100%, we'll still see all of the bumpiness that will be on the surface by adding a bump map. And a bump map is just going to fake the look of a surface that is uneven. So with the clear coat bump set to 100%, it would be like having a thin layer of varnish over our wood surface. But as we decrease that clear coat amount, it would be like pouring more and more of that sealant onto it to where it will eventually build up, and at a clear coat bump value of 0%, the clear coat itself will look smooth even over the top of a surface that underneath has the appearance of some bumpiness, and it will give you the idea or the feeling of some very thick sealant that's been put on a surface, like a wood is a good example. All right, so moving on, we're going to look at one more material here, and to that we're going to go back to our render options, and we're going to go to Ball Cam 3, which will take us up to this ball up in the top. And now let's look at a more truly reflective material. So I'm going to click again on this sphere, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my diffuse amount and turn it all the way down to 0. And instantly the ball is going to turn mostly black because our specular amount is only 4% and our Fresnel is 100%. So once you start crossing over and not dealing with kind of more diffuse materials, these are called dielectric materials, and you start moving into more reflective materials, these are also called metallic materials, you start to see that your diffuse amount will usually go down to 0 or a very small amount, a very small contribution, and our specular amount will jump up, usually in the ballpark of 80% or above. So just like our diffuse amount had been at 80%, we're going to now bump up our specular amount to 80%. And now with that done, we start to see something that looks like a very kind of brushed aluminum, because we have still nicely blurred out reflections, and we can see where all the highlights are coming for, but now it's much more contrasty because our specular amount is much higher. So all that we're seeing in this case is more the essence of kind of a mirrored reflection or a metallic reflection. So as I turn this roughness down, we'll get closer and closer to something like a polished chrome. So if I go down to 20%, and again, I'm just going to mouse over a single part here to kind of refine it, you can see we start to get more definition. Okay, and if we go down to 10%, we'll get even more definition. Usually, for my taste, I kind of like to keep things in the 5 to 10% roughness category, even if I'm doing something that is supposed to be very clear and reflective, unless it's an actual mirror. I just find that it has a little bit more of an interesting look to it. But of course, that's an aesthetic choice that you can make on your own for your own scenes. So let's take this all the way down though, just so we can see it to 0%. And now what we're dealing with is essentially a chrome sphere. So it's highly reflective. It's actually 80% reflective in the center here. And as you get towards the edges, it jumps up to 100% reflectivity. And since we lack any roughness, we'll also see a very nice clear reflection here. This can also be paired fairly well, again, with a clear coat. So that may be something else that you would want to do. And actually here, instead of add this on top of here, let's hop over to our last camera, camera 4. And let's set up a similar material here. So let's select this guy. All right, and so now what we're going to do is I'm going to take and set up the same kind of thing here, and then we'll look at adding in the clear coat. So I'm going to take this value, and I'm just going to set the diffuse to 0. I'm going to set my specular to 80, and we're going to set this back to white. Okay, and then I can set my roughness down, not all the way down, but to maybe 20%. And at this point, I'm going to go in and have, with my 50% clear coat on, I want to see just that nice clear polish over the top. So you get a mixture here in this kind of a case of having something that's going to look like a metallic surface, but with a nice kind of clean layer of polish over the top. So again, when you start adding clear coat along with your regular reflections, especially slightly blurred reflections, you'll get the nice effect of seeing a multi-layered surface. All right, so that does it for this one. And this is kind of the basic ideas that you'll have to look for when you're working with the material ref settings, or again, opaque, solid, non-transmissive materials. And these are going to be a lot of the materials that you will see in most of your scenes. Keep in mind as you work on these, you want to do the balancing between, how much specular, how much reflection and Fresnel you actually need, with, taking that into account with your render time. So as you start to get nice high levels of roughness, you may want to consider knocking down or eliminating your specular and or your Fresnel in order to get something that will still look good but will render significantly faster. So that does it for these opaque materials. In the next lesson, we'll move on to looking at translucent and transparent materials. Thanks, and I will see you in the next lesson.